We can probably agree that we at SuperTokens can improve our content game. And what you're currently watching is the first of hopefully many shows from us. Welcome to Hacking with SuperTokens. Working, hacking, and experimentation in public is a good thing. At least I believe so. Oh, by the way, hi, I'm Darko. I'm doing the developing at SuperTokens. This show is one of our attempts to give back to the general dev knowledge, education, open ecosystems, and ultimately open source projects, besides having an open source product. We lack authenticity and content that brings actual value to those spending the time on that content. So my hope is that I can bring exactly that via hacking with SuperTokens. The plan for each episode is to focus on some sort of experimentation for the web platform, standards, auth, etc. We'll see where this takes us. Some of it will be related to SuperTokens, but we're not here to shill stuff. No, the goal here is entertainment, education, and experimentation. And we value feedback. Via the comments here, Discord, wherever you like. Let us know how we can make this better for you. Okay, enough admin, right? Let's dig in. So, as the title implies, our first experiment, and coincidentally, something we may or may not be working with internally, is building some web components. With SolidJS, no less. Let me give you some context. Personally, I love web standards, but I'll have to admit that the standard web components APIs made me a bit unhappy. What can I say? JSX kinda spoiled me. Well, I'm happy to report that there are plenty of ways to bring that JSX goodness to building web components. One of those ways, and my current favorite, is called Solid Element, which is exactly what it sounds like. SolidJS that happens to compile to web components. So, today, we'll be building some very basic web components with SolidJS, and we'll try them out inside a raw HTML file and maybe inside a React project. Why not? Fair warning though, TypeScript will be complaining quite a bit, but we'll ignore that for now. And the ultimate goal of this entire experiment is to produce an auth library, an auth component library to be more precise, that can be integrated into just about anything out there. But more on that in future episodes. So okay, first things first. Let's first explore what stack are we going to use. Now, the biggest sort of driving force behind this and the build tool is going to be Vite. Everybody uses it, it's a good thing. I mean, most of us in the web dev ecosystem use it, so I suppose it's a good idea. So what we are going to do here is I already have a pre-made template for this, but doesn't matter. Let's start this from scratch. What we're going to do is copy this command over here, take it to the terminal over here. Let's clear this thing up and just let's paste this thing to see how our initial setup is going to look like. So let's just call it a demo project because I already have another folder which I'm going to show a bit later. And we're going to choose SolidJS over here. We're going to choose TypeScript. And we're going to change the folder over to demo project, npm install that, and npm install that, and we're off to the races. So while this thing wraps up, let's have a look at how I changed the Vite config in particular to fit our particular needs. Now, what Vite is going to generate for us is basically this thing over here, what I have highlighted on the screen. The rest of it are just additions to fit our particular use case for compiling down to a file that we would be able to import and use the web components out of there. We'll get to that later. Now, this thing over here is so that we can inject some CSS inside the web components. There are certainly other ways, but this one is sort of convenient, let's say, for experimentation, for proof of concepts. I'm not even sure we are going to use it in this video, but just let it stay there and we can continue with CSS in a follow-up episode. The important thing is over here. Particularly, we are going to compile this thing down to a single file that is going to contain all of our web components that we are going to build today. And the entry point for that is going to be our main.tsx file, which we'll see in a second. And the output name is going to be Solid Web Components, and the output file here is going to be this, Solid Web Components and format.js. When that gets built, it's kind of looking something like this. We have a UMD variation and an ES variation of it. I'm not sure why that's the default, because for the most part I'm using ES, but hey, let's keep it that way, it's fine. Next up is SolidJS. Now, for sort of a brief introduction of the entire thing, it's this React-like, let's call it. It uses JSX, but it doesn't use a virtual DOM. It basically compiles to something far closer to what you can expect to be available inside the DOM, and while allowing us to use signals together with that. We aren't going to be using a whole lot of that now, but that's just for an intro. Now, the important part coming from Solidland and the Solid ecosystem is this, called Solid Element. Now, what Solid Element does is, well, this thing over here. It allows us to register custom elements, or also known as web components, inside any web application, inside the DOM, and invoke those components, something like this. But the interesting part here is that we can write JSX via this. I don't think I can find an example here, but it doesn't matter. I'll show you in a second. Alright, so let's start this thing by comparing the vanilla, let's call it the vanilla Solid Vite project, and what we have customized over here. Now, in the Solid Vite project, the regular one, we just have this config over here. The index file simply imports the entry point, which is index.tsx, which, much like React does, renders a bunch of stuff inside the root element that we have over here. And it's, what Solid does from that point onward. The difference from what we're doing today is we already described what we're doing inside the Vite config, which is different from what we saw in the vanilla project. And our index file, instead of having a root element over there, is basically just this thing over here. Like, we are using main.tsx now. What main.tsx does is it simply imports our hello web component. And our hello web component is just this very, very simple thing. And it uses exactly what we saw in the Solid Element documentation, which is it returns a template of sorts, which happens to be JSX. And we can do most of what we know with JSX inside this component over here. And in turn, we are going to be able to do something like this. We have this component registered as c-hello over here, and we would be able to do this c-hello and use this tag as a custom tag, basically a custom web component there. Now, how that looks in practice. Now, let's first close this thing down and let's npm run dev this thing. And we can actually open localhost 5173 over there, and what we are going to get is hello world. So we have this custom tag opposed to what we saw in the vanilla Vite setup, where basically Solid does all of the rendering, and over here Solid sort of compiles into this thing. We see a custom tag, and we can see that tag inside the DOM over here. Next up, let's see how we can customize this thing by maybe sending it some custom props. So before we customize our message component, let's have a look at the props we saw over here. So custom element as a function takes 3 arguments. The first one is the name of the component, but we didn't exactly have a look at what the other 2 do. So let's figure that one out. As it says over here clearly, so the first is obviously the custom element tag name. The second one is an optional default prop values, as it says here. Some prop 1, some other prop 2, whatever. Props without default values will be ignored by the custom element. Alright, so basically that means that if we want to pass something to it, it has to have a default value, which is fair enough. I'm not sure why that is, but let's roll with it. And the third argument is the solid template function, which is, a function which can return a JSX. Now the arguments of this function are state-wrapped props as the first argument and the underlying element as the second. Alright, so we can also get direct access to the actual DOM node, which is important for other reasons, but we'll get into that into a follow-up episode. So what we want to do now is, let's say, try to customize the message. So how we're going to do that is, let's say, message equals, say, hacking with SuperTokens, and this time around we're just going to use some props, and we need to unpack the message prop from here. Let's say message equals props, and we can just render the message over here. So okay, now nothing spectacular again, but let's see what happens. So currently we have the message as hacking with SuperTokens, but if we change the prop to something else inside the HTML file, let's say we want to override the message to something like, let's say, hello from hacking with SuperTokens. And of course that's going to get updated live, thanks to Vite, by the way. And it can also work with this kind of a more exotic setup that happens to compile web components while developing, which is cool. Kudos for Vite. And inside there we are passing this message prop. Inside the shadow, that prop gets passed inside the tag, and we have a change, our first change for our component. So okay, let's take a second and discuss a bit why we are doing this with web components and not with insert your favorite technology here. Now the prime reason is, like I already said, I happen to be a big believer in standards, and I think that web components have a big future. I personally think that web components sort of suffer from a PR problem, and while the API is, maybe nothing to compare directly to what we can do using declarative stuff like JSX, React, whatever, I do think that standards have a future and should be a regular tool in our utility belts for building, any kinds of web applications. So yeah, the reason that I'm doing this with web components primarily is that so it can work in pretty much anything you choose. So in a sense, it's for your own benefit and for the benefit of everybody working on the web. So finally, let's see this thing in action. First off, we want to build it, of course. The way we can do that is just by running npm run build. And what that does is it produces these two JavaScript files that end up in the dist directory over here and contain all of the code necessary to reuse that hello custom tag. So what we are going to do now over here is something that we used to do back in the olden days: copying and pasting raw JavaScript files like savages. So we're going to paste that over here, and we are going to import that script. Let's delete this thing, we don't need it, it was from my previous experimentation. But the thing that's important is this: we are defining a script with a type of module and giving it a source attribute of solid-web-components.umd.js, and this is what we have in the same path. In order to test this out properly, we need to start HTTP server. So cd demos, let's have a look at cd HTML, and that was HTTP. I already have one installed called HTTP server, and yeah, whatever, let's run it on 3000 because my autocomplete thinks it's a good idea. And if we run this, we don't see anything. That's because we didn't really include anything over here. But we already have that c-hello tag, right? And that should be working fine. Yes, so we have hacking with SuperTokens over here. So what we did so far is create this thing in a TSX file, basically like what you would expect in React, just the standard JSX markup, nothing else. Build it via Vite over here, some sort of magic with transpilers, produce these two files, import them in a regular HTML file, not in live mode or anything like that, and have a custom tag in place. And this has the nice side effect of being reusable basically anywhere. We can use this in a React project, we can use this literally wherever like HTML works, and if we have a reasonably modern browser, that is. But we can certainly call most of modern browsers like reasonable, so I suppose we don't really have a problem there, right? Right. So let's have a look at what happens if we customize the message over here. Let's change it to hello from the HTML demo. And let's reload that, and sure enough, the message changes. So cool. So we have this thing running inside an HTML file. Now let's try it out in something more interesting, such as a React project. So alright, back to our friend Vite, which happens to also support React quite nicely, and we are going to rerun the entire thing all over. Let's call it like React demo, because we are going to be using React this time around. Let's do React, TypeScript, sure, great. Let's change the directory to React demo, let's npm install this thing. Okay, so now that that's done, let's have a look at, let's actually run this thing. Let's see what's up with it. So back to localhost 5173, and what you usually get with a Vite plus React scaffold. Nothing special. So let's blow that all up. We don't need any of it. So let's go down to React demo. And this is an entirely different project in the same directory, like kind of dirty without, any extra steps to make it a proper monorepo, but like who cares? This is an experimentation, a demo, exploration, whatever you want to call it. But either way. So inside app.main.tsx, we have the app component. Now we can sort of, let's just remove not all of them, but let's remove the CSS file. We aren't going to be using that. Let's remove the CSS file over here, the Vite, the React logo, the use state. We aren't going to be using that. We aren't going to be using this as well. So, let's remove all of this here. And let's say we clean this all up and just put a hello world in there. Tradition, I suppose. And sure enough, we have a hello world in there. Now, the way that we can import this thing and not make it too dirty is, just copy paste the same two files, import one of them, and actually reference one of the components. Now again, fair warning, TypeScript is going to complain quite a bit about this one. So let's copy these two, go over to React demo, let's create a components folder, why not? Because these are components after all. Not in the same sense that React treats them as components, but whatever. And we have those two files. Now, actually, we don't need both of them, but sure, whatever. Let's keep both of them there. So, okay, right now we have this React thing over here, and what we'll do is import the raw path from what we have in the components directory currently, solid-web-components and /.es. I don't think we need the JS specifically, and it's probably not going to die, or is it? Solid-web-components.es. Oh, yeah, there's a type components. Perfect. Okay, so it's complaining that it cannot find the file, but it has an any type. Like I said, TypeScript is going to complain quite a bit. There is a way around that, but we are going to explore that in some follow-up episode. It's not something that we want to do today. So our was c-hello, our component was called, right? Right, I think so. Alright, hacking with SuperTokens. So we have this running from inside React, which is cool, I have to admit. If we pass it a prop with, let's say, message, whatever, hello from React, and it does the hello from React thing. Amazing. Let's do something even more interesting. Let's do const set message or sorry, message and set message, and do a use state hook over here with a hello from React. Yes, and we can maybe use the message over here. Not even sure about this one, to be honest, but you know, try anything, right? It works. Hello from React. Interesting. So right, so far we made this component in Solid using SolidJS, built it via the Vite config over here into these two files, which contain all of the code that you need to use it as a web component, ran it inside HTML, and finally ran it inside React. Oh, sorry, that's not what we want to show. This is it. So, you know, TypeScript is going to complain. There are two ways to resolve this for a follow-up episode. We can either ignore this, which is, you know, the bad way, and probably somebody's picking up a pitchfork right now for me saying that. But the other, or the nicer way, is to define types for this thing, which you can do, and you can actually even export them from the original Solid library, but you know, we'll get into that in a follow-up episode. Of course, I'll open source this, and I'll leave a link in the show description for this one. And in the following episode, we are going to try to integrate a bunch of SuperTokens functionalities and build some pre-made authentication screens using what we have in the docs in SuperTokens. Now, fair warning, maybe not all of it will work properly. We'll be copy-pasting a whole bunch of stuff. But, you know, that's part of the fun, like debugging live, working in public, failing in public, which, you know, I aim to normalize as much as possible. Thanks for watching, and see you next week when we dig into some more web components and building a full-on authentication solution using web components, Solid, and some SuperTokens goodness. See you next time.